The standalone MPCs can do everything. Do they do it well? The MPC One is positioned as a standalone device that can do pretty much everything. So I figured it would be interesting to actually make a song that does pretty much everything. There is, of course, some stuff I'm going to miss, but I wanted to hit on a bunch of the major capabilities that the MPC has. This includes your basic vanilla beat making, genre hopping, multiple aspects of sampling, recording live instruments, sequencing and recording hardware synths via MIDI, live performance, and making full songs. Also, I should mention that this will lean a bit positive because it's kind of an exploration of features rather than a review, but I paid for this device with my own money, and I am never afraid of pissing off brands by giving caveats, which you will receive some of in this video. Let's jump into it. First off, we've got drum programs, which can get very in-depth and are kind of the bedrock on which everything else rests. They're the bread and butter of the kind of generic concept of beat making. You could make an entire beat quite competently without ever leaving drum programs. And I've covered these super in depth before, so I'm going to link some videos at the end of this one because I don't want to repeat myself too much. But I will play this in isolation and mention that this is the MPC kit from my $5 sample pack, linked in the description. Helps keep the channel going. This other section of the drums was made with a machine kit that I converted using KitMaker. By the way, this clap sounds best when shifted forward a bit, and the easiest way to get that is to hop into the grid and select that track, and you can see how it just lit up all the instances of that clap. Then you can just turn off your snaps and scoot it around until you've nailed it. Just by ear until it feels about right. The select everything by hitting a pad, by the way, is one of the more useful features of the grid. It can seem very clunky to work with, and to a degree it is, but there are some things that make it a lot easier to work with. For instance, I never use this erase. When I hold down Shift, I have the option to cut, which is a lot easier to work with. I also have the option to copy and paste. So maybe I do a bunch of minute time shifting or playing stuff in unquantized and trying to really nail the feel of something. I can then grab, say, just this passage here and copy that forward. That makes it a lot easier to work with. Plus, in this case, I've played this shaker piece in here with 16 levels set to velocity. And don't forget that we do have a fairly basic step sequencer. All of this stuff works well together pretty well. And I should just say, to sum that up, the grid is definitely slower to work with than a standard piano roll in a DAW. But at this point, since I'll play a lot of stuff in live and then use these to copy and paste stuff around or remove stuff that didn't work, it can be pretty fast to work with. I like having it here. I'd rather have it here than not have it here. And it at least doesn't slow me down too much. Since I just showed you drum patterns for two different genres, now's as good a time as any to mention versatility. The MPC, being a sampler, is very versatile because of course it can have any sound you want in it. But the modern MPCs take this even further because they're basically little computers with full hardware interfaces. So they're very much built to be applicable to multiple different genres of music, and I've had good luck using them for hip hop and multiple styles of electronic music. They are pretty versatile, even if they've still got an emphasis on what they're famous for. And once again, I did a dedicated video on using the MPC to its strengths for making hip hop that I'll link at the end of this one. Now, another aspect of sampling is Keygroup programs, and I want to put a special emphasis on it's multi-sampled Keygroup programs. The MPC has a really competent auto sampler in here, which you can connect to an external hardware synth and just steal its essence, which is really nice. In this case, for this main brass pad, I'm using a patch by fellow synth tuber Jorb, which is lovely. And you can even do stuff like velocity levels. So here's full level versus half level, for instance. And I've got one finger chords activated in this case. Here's another Jorb patch. And in this case, I am using some of the effects plugins. I love the granulator. The reverb is, it's okay. Gets the job done in this case. Another multi-sampled Keygroup program, this one from my $5 Keygroup pack, also linked in the description. And then I've basically used the plugins to completely wash it out and push it into the background. And the main lead duties are also being handled by one of my Keygroup programs. This one sampled from my Microfreak. And you will notice that I have Portamento activated, which brings it to life quite a bit more. You'd be less likely to guess that this was sampled. And on top of that, just a little bit of effects. The granulator, which makes it just feel a lot less static and a lot more floaty. And of course, you can load static samples in here and just pitch it around as needed. That's kind of the standard use for Keygroup programs. So here's my 808. So far, we've mostly stayed within the MPC itself, and now it's time to bring in external instruments, starting with guitar. And usual disclaimer, I am not a guitarist. I'm a producer and drummer first. I know enough very basic stuff to kind of stumble my way through a part, and that's about it. But there is some nice guitar-centric stuff that I want to show you. For instance, if you go into Sampler and hit this little button right here, you get a full guitar tuner, which is really nice. Plus, there's a dedicated amp sim plugin that was introduced in a firmware update. It is, as far as I can tell, adequate. And to actually record stuff, there are dedicated ways to record audio. I can go to input configuration here. Basically, the way I like to record stuff is to have effects active going in, like an amp, so I can play through an amp. I'll record stuff, and then I'll just load it onto a drum track. And in both of these cases, I have double-tracked my guitars and panned them hard left and right. So here's some footage of me struggling to record these very basic guitar parts and messing around with some amp settings. Building on the use of external instruments, let's now not only use the MPC as the recording device, but also as the brain device. In the case of the beat that is kind of the focus of this video, I used the MPC to sequence and record my Korg Minilogue. This actually came together way easier than I expected. I was expecting there to be some friction in setting this up, and nope, it was super straightforward. So let me quickly show you what I've got going here. I have a MIDI cable running out of the MPC's out into the MIDI input of the Minilogue, and the audio output of the Minilogue running into one of the inputs of the MPC. So far, so straightforward. As far as the settings go, there are a few important things to keep in mind. First of all, I have turned programmed channel off because that's going to like scroll through presets on the Minilogue, which I very much did not want to do. I want to just set that on the device itself. And I've set the MIDI port to the MPC. So that just means that the MIDI port of the MPC is going to be sending MIDI to the Minilogue. And I should mention, I haven't experienced at least any noticeable latency within this whole pipeline. And then with audio, if I go to this audio tab here, I've got an audio track. If I pop open this little eyeball icon, which is really hard to see because it's very small, At this point, I've turned off all my effects except for the mother ducker, but the key thing is I've set my input to input 2, which is the input that the Minilogue is fed into. The out is just the normal out, and then you can start adding effects. And so in this case, I've got the ducker feeding in from the kick. And now I can also record that if I want, although I would probably just end up dropping this into a drum track and reapplying the ducking separately. But I've got that flexibility. This actually turned out in its most basic form to be really easy to work with. I'm sure if you wanted to run a more complicated setup, this can get way more complicated way more quickly, but I was pretty impressed with how easy this was. So now I want to go ahead and actually record this thing into the MPC so I can kind of harvest those tracks for use later, and so that I can still have that part once I disconnect this whole setup. So there are multiple ways to do this. Here's the lazy man's way. I'm going to duplicate this entire sequence, and now that I'm in sequence 4, I'm going to double the length of it. Well, let's do twice. I want to do 3 passes of this, plus like a little 4th bonus pass. I'm going to do one where the filter is totally closed, one where I'm raising the filter over time, and then third when the filter is just in its permanent raised state. So I'm gonna hit record, play from start, and everything should just like be in perfect sync and give me like a nice, easy, clean recording. And it switched to overdub, and I haven't gotten it to like record overdubs, so that's why I just multiplied this pattern a bunch. That seems like it worked pretty cleanly. So once again, leaning into the lazy man's way of doing this, I've already created a drum program, and I'm just going to load that sample into it for now, because this is just for like exporting purposes. So let me mute my MIDI. Cool. So that's in our sample pool now, the entire thing. And I very deliberately waited until the full 8 bars passed to start fiddling with this thing. That way, when the cutoff is all the way closed, there's a full 8 bars of the cutoff being closed, so that should loop perfectly, so I can use it as much as I need to. Same deal with the cutoff being all the way open. But now I've got this big all audio file that's already in perfect sync with everything that I can just use as I need to, which is quite nice. But of course, it is worth mentioning that for a simple pluck sound, this is kind of overkill. I did this because it's fun, not because it's necessary. And in fact, I made a comparison with the built-in Hype Synth, one of the free synth plugins. Now, that definitely doesn't sound as good, although note that the bass is missing, and that's one of the reasons. And I kind of have to be a bit careful with how much I lift the cutoff, but in the context of a mix, it's fine. By the way, Hype is definitely my most frequently used synth plugin on this thing. It's fairly hands-on, pretty versatile, decently powerful. They also sell it as a VST plugin for your DAW. I wouldn't buy that personally. I just wouldn't bother. I'd use something else. But in this form factor, it gets the job done. There are other free synth plugins in here that are pretty good as well. I actually do use Tube Synth occasionally, and the drum synth is quite good. I covered that in my full review. But let's now talk about paid plugins. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, you do not need to buy these. The MPC One was a great device before these were introduced. It's still a great device now, and you can get by and absolutely kill it with the free plugins and with Keygroup programs. But they do offer some pretty good sounds. If you want some solid acoustic or electric pianos, FM, or just more sounds to play with, they're worth at least trying. For instance, for the track that this video is centered around, I'm using Fabric for a couple of parts. First of all, for this pretty stylized acoustic piano. And it's got a pretty over-the-top effects section on it with flavor active going through this amp sim and pretty heavy vinyl emulation. I'm playing this stuff intentionally soft. You got the delay on there as well. And then I also have another instance of Fabric with this electric piano. I do also want to mention that while I find myself reaching for the Fabric electric pianos a bit more, there was an original free electric piano plugin that shipped with this thing at least pretty early on, and that is still there. So if you need electric pianos, you've already got something. And finally, let's talk a bit about the song mode and live performance. So the song mode itself is pretty bare bones. You basically just put your sequences in order. You can then put that into one big mega sequence for finer tweaks if you want. I don't find myself doing that. And personally, I find myself actually just making one really solid 8-bar loop, duplicating that a couple of times and making variations, like you've heard, and then exporting those individually, bringing them into my DAW and arranging and mixing it there, which is what I did for the final version of this song, which landed on a beat tape that I put out fairly recently. Regardless, the thing to keep in mind is that each sequence operates completely independently. If you want to have a bunch of very subtle changes along the song mode, you have to have a bunch of duplicate sequences, and then if you want to change anything about the note information for, say, a chord progression or an instrument part, you have to change it across every sequence because they're all separate from each other. That being said, it is nice that this has a song mode, but personally, I don't really use it much. And for live performance, it's fun for some kind of YouTube jamming type stuff, like what I did in the intro. And there are some fun tools like the XY effects. But if it were me, I wouldn't use the MPC One for live performance. I would probably gravitate more towards something like the Akai Force or the Innovation Circuits. Although if I'm being really honest with myself, I would probably just pick up a proper DJ controller, teach myself that, and call it a day. So while this video was mostly an excuse to try all of these features, try to use them all at once, and of course to subject you to the song that this video was centered around, here's my overall lukewarm take. The MPC One is a jack of many trades, master of some. A lot of the stuff it aims to do is done pretty well. The biggest barrier is probably the user interface. The MPC often suffers not from a lack of ability, but a lack of clarity. A lot of the really basic stuff is pretty intuitive once you get over the initial learning curve, but some features, like the guitar tuner I showed you earlier, while not necessarily too hard to get to, are hidden in unexpected or unintuitive places. And certain operations on this thing are hidden under multiple unintuitive steps, to the point that a lot of regular users, myself included, might not bother with some of the more advanced features most of the time. Overall, the MPC suffers from a lot of feature creep, making it feel bloated and unfocused. But I still stick with it and find myself repeatedly coming back to it because of how much it can do if I've got the patience for it. Plus, it is the most focused parts that keep me coming back the most. I did a video on it using its strengths to make hip-hop beats. You can check out this video up over here to see that. And if you'd like to see just a really broad overview of a bunch of the basic features and a deeper dive into some of its previous firmware updates, I've got you covered up over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.